In one short assault, several Russian defensive positions were broken, armored vehicles were hit, and a small village under Russian control changed hands. What looked at first like another local clash quickly turned into something far more serious. This was not a lone infantry rush into a damaged settlement. Ukrainian forces moved in with a coordinated mechanized thrust as Bradley fighting vehicles pushed infantry close to the edge of the village and pressed Russian firing points from behind. Then the battle began to unfold layer by layer. The first line was broken, and the houses that still held Russian troops started turning into isolated pockets of resistance. That is where the real danger began. Once the outer defense was cracked, the fight stopped being only about getting into the village. One side had to clear houses, seal off strongpoints, and cut the roads that could bring reinforcements back in, while the other had to react fast, push troops back toward the village, and stop the whole position from collapsing. The key moment was not only the breakthrough itself, but what came right after, when Russian resistance did not disappear and instead started returning from several directions at once. The real question now is no longer how Ukraine broke into the village. The real question is what happens after the first breach, when the fight stops being a simple assault and turns into a rolling clash and repeated attempts to take the position back. The attack begins with movement, not with impact, because the most important step at this stage is getting close enough to the village without giving Russian defenders a clean target too early. A Ukrainian mechanized element moves toward the settlement in a controlled push, and the formation already shows that this is not a reckless charge into built-up terrain. Bradley vehicles bring infantry toward the edge of the built-up area, while Abrams tanks remain slightly farther back and use their presence to pressure the first known defensive points. Nothing in this opening phase is designed to win the whole village at once. The immediate task is smaller and more precise, which is to open the first gap and force the defense to react before it can settle into a full response. What makes this opening important is the way the battlefield is read before the first soldiers step into the streets. Ukrainian drones move ahead of the armored group and scan the entrances, the empty yards, and the first line of houses that face the approach route. That early look matters because a village fight can go wrong in seconds if the lead vehicles drive toward a firing point that was not spotted in time. The drone crews are not searching for every hidden soldier at once. They are trying to answer a more urgent question. Where is the surviving Russian fire can still hit the advancing force as it crosses from open ground into the village edge? Once that picture becomes clear enough, the armored vehicles do not linger. Bradley crews bring the infantry close, but not in a way that leaves a cluster of men standing around the drop point. The dismount happens fast, and the soldiers spread to both sides almost at once. That detail matters because the first seconds after leaving the vehicle are often the most dangerous. If the troops gather in one place, a single burst of fire, a mortar round, or a grenade can damage the whole assault group before it has even entered the first houses. By dispersing immediately, the Ukrainians reduce that danger and make it harder for the Russian side to stop the entire advance with one well-placed shot. At the same time, the Abrams element does not rush into the tightest part of the village. Its role in this phase is to keep pressure on likely defensive positions and make Russian troops hesitate before exposing themselves. That support does not need to destroy every point of resistance in the first minute. It only needs to force the defenders to keep their heads down long enough for the infantry and Bradley crews to cross the most exposed stretch. In a fight like this, a few moments of suppressed return fire can be enough to shift the whole direction of the opening clash. The first objective is not the center of the village, and it is not total control over every building. Ukraine needs one section of the outer defense to bend, because even a narrow breach can change the shape of the battle that follows. Once that outer line is disturbed, the Russian side has to make quick decisions under pressure. It must decide whether to hold its first houses, pull back toward the next row of cover, or bring fire onto the entry points before the attackers spread deeper into the settlement. That is exactly where the next danger begins. The assault has reached the edge of the village, but the hardest part is only starting. If Ukraine is fast enough, the breach can widen before Russian forces recover and rebuild a line inside the settlement. If that moment is missed, The entry can stall, the pressure can shift, and the fight can turn into a costly struggle for a few buildings instead of a controlled advance. The battle enters a more dangerous phase once Ukrainian forces stop focusing only on getting into the village and begin breaking the defense from the inside. At this point, the first line has already been touched, but that alone does not decide anything. What matters now is whether the units that entered at the edge can turn that narrow opening into a wider collapse. That is where Bradley crews, Abrams support, and infantry movement begin working together in a much more deliberate way. Bradley vehicles take the lead in this stage by using direct fire against the first Russian positions that still hold the front. Their role is not simply to hit visible targets. Their fire is used to force defenders off their first firing points and to prevent Russian troops from watching the streets freely. Once rounds begin striking walls, corners, and openings, the men inside those positions have fewer safe angles to shoot from and less time to react. That pressure needs to make the outer layer of defense unstable enough for the infantry to move deeper without being cut down in the open. Behind that action, Abrams tanks do not rush into the tightest spaces of the village. Their task is heavier and more controlled. They remain in support and continue suppressing stronger resistance points that could still disrupt the assault from slightly deeper inside the settlement. These are the positions that may not be easy for infantry to handle in the first minutes, and may also be too dangerous for Bradley vehicles to challenge alone from close range. By keeping those locations under pressure from behind the forward element, the Abrams force Russian defenders to stay cautious and reduce the chance of a sudden, organized response. This arrangement gives the Ukrainian side a short period in which the assault groups can move before the defense fully resets. That opening is used quickly. Ukrainian infantry does not advance in one mass through a single street. One element pushes into the houses directly ahead and keeps immediate pressure on the nearest Russian defenders. Another group shifts toward the side of the village and begins working along the flank. That second movement matters just as much as the forward push, because the goal is not only to gain more ground. The goal is to cut the small links that hold the defense together. Once those connecting routes are threatened, the defensive line begins losing its internal shape. This is where the Russian side starts facing a different kind of crisis. At the beginning, it was defending an outer belt of positions that still had some connection to each other. Now those positions are being pressed from the front, while side routes are also coming under threat. Instead of one defensive line, there are now several small points of resistance, each still dangerous, but each less able to function as part of a coordinated whole. The assault is no longer just entering the village. It is beginning to break the village defense into isolated fights. The question now is simple and important. Was the first breach only a local success at the edge of the village, or was it the moment the entire defensive layout started to come apart? Once Ukrainian troops move past the outer edge, the pace drops immediately. The battle stops being driven mainly by vehicles and suppressive fire, and shifts into a close struggle around houses, damaged yards, and dark basements where Russian defenders may still be holding on. From this point on, every delay becomes more serious because the fight is no longer about reaching the village. It is about stopping the defense from rebuilding itself inside the village. Ukrainian infantry cannot move through this phase in one smooth push. They enter one house, secure the nearest rooms, check the path behind them, and then move to the next structure only when the last one is under control. The route forward has to stay clean, because a single uncleared position behind the line of advance can turn into a threat within minutes. A village can look half taken from above and still remain dangerous on the ground. Some Russian troops stay inside houses that were not fully cleared during the first rush. Others fall back into basements or damaged corners and wait for a moment to fire at close range. The attack continues, but the rhythm changes from speed to control. This part of the battle becomes slower because even small groups can still cause trouble after the first line has been pierced. A handful of defenders in the right building can stall a whole section, especially if they force Ukrainian troops to stop, split their attention, or shift their direction. The pressure no longer comes from a solid front. It comes from scattered points that survive in place and try to delay the assault long enough for the situation outside the village to change. Ukrainian units begin handling each uncleared building as its own problem. Some are entered and secured quickly. Others are blocked, watched, and left isolated for the moment when the risk of a direct entry is too high. The assault keeps moving, but it now moves with much more caution. The internal shape of the battle starts changing at this stage. What had been a connected Russian defense is now breaking into separate pockets. Those pockets are still dangerous, but they are no longer controlling the whole village as one line. They are trying to hold on, slow the tempo, and create enough time for the next Russian response to form. Ukrainian troops respond by shrinking the space where those pockets can still function. They clear one section, cut movement between the next two houses, secure a passage, and then press again. The result is not a dramatic collapse in one moment. It is a gradual tightening of control inside the village, where each cleared building reduces the room left for Russian resistance to operate. At the same time, the burden on the Ukrainian side is growing. Troops that entered behind Bradley cover are now deeper inside a built-up area where armored support cannot solve every problem. The danger is no longer only in front of them. Russian defenders are no longer trying to win the whole village back at this stage. They are trying to make the village costly enough to slow the assault before it becomes irreversible. That effort begins to affect the timing of the attack, because every stubborn point takes minutes away from the wider operation. This is where the next turn in the battle begins to appear. At that moment, another layer of fire is brought into the fight, not to replace the troops inside the village, but to deal with the strong points they do not want to approach head-on. The next shift in the battle comes when Ukrainian infantry reaches positions that are still dangerous, but no longer worth attacking at close range. By this stage, the assault has already moved beyond the first breach and into the harder work inside the village, yet some Russian firing points remain too well placed to be cleared quickly by men moving room to room. That is when another layer enters the fight. Heavy drones are brought in and used not simply as another weapon, but as a way to hit positions that are still holding up the advance from inside buildings or from the edge of the defensive area. The target is not only the structure itself. The target is the defender's confidence that he can stay hidden and keep firing without being reached. Once those drones begin dropping explosives onto strongpoints, the pressure inside the village changes again. Russian troops who had been relying on cover inside damaged houses or near protected firing spots are forced to move, and the moment they move, they become easier to detect and easier to track. A position that had delayed the assault for several minutes can lose its value very fast when overhead attack becomes part of the fight. Ukrainian infantry does not need every strike to destroy a building completely. It only needs those strikes to break the hold of the defenders, force them away from the best corners, and create a few more openings for the troops on the ground to keep advancing. At almost the same time, Russian commanders start trying to push reinforcements forward with armored vehicles, because once the first line has broken and the inner defense is under pressure, time becomes critical. If fresh troops can reach the village fast enough, they may stabilize part of the line, strengthen the remaining pockets, and slow the Ukrainian assault before it turns into full control. But those incoming routes have already been watched. Another Ukrainian drones group were also scanning the roads, tracks, and approach lanes that any rescue force would have to use. The moment Russian vehicles reveal their direction, they enter a very different kind of danger. Instead of arriving as reinforcements, they begin to look like targets in motion. Ukrainian crews follow them from above, and once the direction is clear, the strikes begin to stack up. One vehicle was hit first to block the path. Another come under anti-tank fire before it can unload troops. A third was forced to stop and break formation under the pressure of repeated attack. The result is not always immediate destruction across the whole column. The result is disruption, and disruption is enough. Once that happens, the timing of the Russian response begins to fall apart. This has a direct effect on the troops still fighting inside the village. The defenders who are trying to hold out do not receive support when they need it most. The men outside who are trying to react cannot arrive in proper order. Instead of one clean countermove, The response turns into several broken attempts that appear too late and under too much pressure. The battlefield starts working against them. What should have been a route back into the village becomes a hunted corridor where every visible movement invites another strike. The strongest question in this phase is also the simplest one. Was the real turning point the first breach at the edge of the village? Or was it the moment the reinforcement routes stopped being a lifeline and turned into a trap? The final phase of the battle begins when Russian forces try to come back from several directions, but the fight no longer follows their timing. After losing most of the village, they do not give up the position at once. Small groups begin moving again from the outer edges, and the intention is clear. They want to get back into the ruined streets before Ukrainian troops can turn a successful assault into stable control. Some fighters move along back gardens, some use tree lines, and others try to slip through the narrow spaces between damaged houses. The effort is not organized like the earlier defense. It is more fragmented, more urgent, and more dependent on speed. Those return attempts quickly run into the same problem that had already damaged the reinforcement effort from outside. Ukrainian drones are still overhead, and the battle space around the village is no longer open to quiet movement. Men who try to approach from the flanks are spotted early. Groups trying to gather behind broken walls or near side paths do not stay hidden for long. Once movement is identified, Ukrainian fire begins to cut into those attempts before they can grow into a real counterattack. FPV drones start hunting the most exposed elements, while artillery is used to strike the roots and small clusters that are trying to form. Russian troops are not being met by one single defensive wall. They are being broken apart before they can build one. Inside the village, Ukraine makes an important shift very quickly. The assault phase begins to turn into a holding phase, and this transition may be one of the most important parts of the whole operation. Troops who were pushing forward only minutes earlier now begin securing the ground they have just taken. Observation teams are moved into useful positions with clear lines of sight over the nearest approaches. The most likely directions of a Russian return are covered. Bradley crews turn their guns outward, not deeper into the village, because the next danger is no longer in front of the assault teams. The next danger is the force trying to come back in. This change gives the battle a new shape. Ukraine is no longer trying to win more space as fast as possible. It is trying to deny Russia the chance to rebuild the fight. Every path back toward the village must now pass under observation, under drone pressure, or into fire that is already waiting. Once that happens, each new Russian attempt becomes weaker than the last one because it arrives late, under pressure, and without enough support to change the situation. Darkness does not solve that problem. As evening falls, the pressure on Russian forces does not disappear. Ukraine continues using drones and forward observation to keep the area watched, which makes it much harder for Russian troops to exploit the night and move back in with confidence. A settlement that looked briefly open after the first breach now becomes much more hostile to any return. The ruined houses, damaged yards, and broken lanes no longer serve only as cover for defenders. They are now part of a space Ukraine is actively controlling. By the end of this phase, Russian counterattacks are no longer able to change the outcome. The result is clear. Ukraine regains the village, and Russian troops begin pulling back from the area after failing to build enough force to take it back. That gives Ukrainian units the time and space to regroup, secure their positions, and prepare for the next stage of the fight. What happened in this village was not a simple armored push that smashed through, fired a few rounds, and pulled away. It was a tightly connected battle made up of several linked phases, and each phase mattered because the next one depended on the last. Ukraine first reached the edge of the village, then opened the first breach, pushed infantry into the houses, used heavier fire to deal with the hardest strongpoints, and finally turned the captured ground into a defensive position strong enough to survive the Russian response. That is the real meaning of this fight. The most important story was not a single Bradley, a single Abrams, or a single drone strike. The real story was how those elements were combined into one continuous chain of pressure. From a wider view, this kind of assault suggests that even a small village can now become a highly complex contest of speed, firepower, and control after the first breach. And that leaves one larger question. If this pattern keeps appearing in other sectors, will future fighting be decided more by who captures ground first, or by who can lock the area down fast enough to make a counterattack fail before it fully begins? Share thoughts in the comments. If this breakdown was useful, like the video, share it, and subscribe to Military Force for more reporting on real battles, modern weapons, and the strategy behind the fight.